Alright everyone, we start off today talking about Mike Pence, Louie Gohmert, MSM propaganda, and a few other related topics, all part of a very strange legal case, and I'll try to explain the situation because it's quite complex. But first and foremost, I am now abused by YouTube, which has instituted algorithmic manipulation in order to harm independent content creators. So if you want to make this video more searchable by sharing it out on some other site, I appreciate that. Conversely, though, I'm also on 4 other video hosting sites, link in the description, and also on a pinned comment on YouTube, sites which do not abuse me. So Louie Gohmert opened up a case against Mike Pence, seeking to empower Mike Pence. Now, I'll say to affirm his pre-existing electoral powers. Some people would construe it another way and try to say that he's trying to give him more powers over election proceedings. See, the vice president has an outsized role when it comes to the election process in the certification of the electors. Now, the first thing I would say is that you need to understand, essentially what this would do is construe his part of the process. If the suit were successful, if the judge were to take up the case, like Gohmert refiles, Pence is asking him to refile against the legislature because they're the ones that are actually a proper defendant. Pence is the one that Gohmert is seeking to empower, yet he's suing Mike Pence. I'm not, by the way, entirely sure why he decided to do that, because, I mean, he's a lawmaker for a long time. Obviously, he knows the process that a court uses. I don't know how he made the mistake of suing the wrong person. Essentially, it would either empower Pence or affirm his pre-existing power to throw out electors simply because of objection, as opposed to the generally construed process. And the election law, you got to understand, is deliberately full of holes and vagary in order to give it more malleability. Because of the way that our justice system especially tends to work, because of the way our government works, oftentimes if it ain't broke, they don't fix it, even if there are glaring loopholes. And I'd say they've definitely done this with the tax code for maybe more malevolent purposes. It is therefore not technically established by binding decision whether the vice president has that power. Gohmert is seeking to affirm or add that power, depending on which side you happen to be on. And Pence, by the way, if the suit succeeds, is between a cock and a hard place. Because then he has the inauspicious task of either alienating every Republican in the country or alienating every Democrat in the country. Those are the only choices he would have. I am not 100% sure that is something that Pence would want to have to partake in. I know that Pence would prefer to be vice president for 4 more years. Now, I do not believe he's a coward. He's consistently stood behind Trump. I realize he's lukewarm neocon in many ways, but he sort of, he kisses ring, so to speak. But would he want to do that at the expense of causing, being responsible for what I would consider to be a considerable amount of chaos? And let's say that he decides to go with the official election tallies. Well, then he's alienating all the Republicans, and certainly his political career would be completely over. His public life would be shit, because he'd get shouted at probably every time he tries to go to the fucking restaurant, and inevitably with his wife. It'd be a big problem. But Gohmert's suit, suing a person in order to give them more power just doesn't make any sense, and I'm not exactly sure what harebrained staffer decided to draw it up that way. But again, keep in mind, the odds of the federal court, let's say Gohmert refiles in a more proper manner, the idea that they're going to sign on to and affirm an emergency stay of the situation in order to decide whether Mike Pence has this pre-existent constitutional role, the federal court probably just wouldn't take the case up. It's been left vacuous for a reason. The court probably will choose to do what SCOTUS has done now multiple times and simply not weigh in at all. Dismiss the case out of hand and say that they just don't want to discuss the matter. This is one of the biggest problems with our judicial system, which is that I think, and I think many people believe this as well, I think that the courts have ultimately too much discretion over when they take cases. I think that some sort of process needs to be implemented to compel them to take cases, especially at the highest levels, especially in federal courts. And those decisions, if not brought before SCOTUS, become binding. In my opinion, and this is my opinion, being not a legal scholar, but as someone who's also not biased, I think that it's implied that the vice president does indeed have the general capability in a contested situation to refer to the state legislatures and have those bodies choose the slate of electors. Essentially, he could also have the power to nullify a state's votes if there was an outstanding litigation of some sort that meant that the votes, technically speaking, could not be certified, despite the electors having actually cast their votes. It is implied in his mandate that he's capable of saying, well, that state's votes can't count. But that's just an implication. It's not explicit. Hence the court case. The problem is trying to get the court to take up the case. If the case is not taken up, Pence will not have that power because the House of Representatives, led by the Democrats, by Pelosi, will say, look, the electors you can have your 2-hour objection session, which will happen. Hawley and all of these others will give their speeches and so forth, and it will be a little bit of a ruckus. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they will maintain the normal decorum. And if Mike Pence were to attempt to get up on his podium and assert that right, it would cause an all-out revolt with the Democrats, and a huge legal issue would erupt, and it'd be sort of like Civil War-era politics. There have been other contested elections. You've had several instances where there have been problems with minting a new president. Again, though, in the modern sense, it's a little bit different. You got to understand that when you're talking about like the early 1800s, you're dealing with a government that was considerably more vacuous even than it is now. And sometimes back then, because things were more laissez-faire, because things were, the United States certainly wasn't a nuclear power, didn't have like a deep state entrenched in because it didn't have a need for it. There was no mutually assured destruction. There were no nukes. There were no commies around and stuff like that. To deal with, things operated a little bit differently. The United States in its earlier, especially pre-Civil War incarnation and through Reconstruction, is a different nation than the one that we have in the wake of World War I. So I would really be hesitant to believe that they're even going to take the case. They'll throw out Gohmert's case under advisement from not only Pence but multiple other parties. This will get thrown out. It might get refiled, and you have a proper defendant then. But you can't force the court to even consider it. The court can just say, oh, well, we're dismissing the suit because they can basically decide, even if it's obvious that their decision is not technically legal at all, they could just say, well, Louie Gohmert doesn't have legal standing to sue the House of Representatives and the Senate over this issue, and they can make up basically whatever reason they want, and really, unless you're going to appeal that to SCOTUS, and bring it before the Supreme Court directly or something, and you'd need a lot of people behind it to get that to possibly happen, then it's dead in the water. The problem is, again, the reluctance of the courts, number one, and number two, the vacuous nature of the wording in regards to U.S. election law as per the electors, as per the actual certification, which the Vice President does indeed preside over. It's honestly more likely that Mike Pence is just going to troll them by bringing in a fake Dominion voting machine and chuckling at them and forcing them to use that in order to tally their electors' votes cast. That's more likely than that the court takes up the case, which wouldn't change anything, but it would at least be very funny and quite epic. That's about all. Peace out.